Hello, everybody in the IOTSA community. Thank you very much for joining us for the next session in the Secure Connections podcast. My name is Ryan Morris, and I'll be your host and interviewer today. I will be joined today by Brad Gross. Brad is the president and founder of the law offices of Bradley Gross, and we're very happy to have an actual certified expert in to join us in this conversation today and get some of the perspective on cybersecurity that we might not be thinking of from a technology or services point of view. Brad, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Welcome. So the first thing that I always like to understand from our guests as we get started in the conversation, so how did you arrive at the point where cybersecurity was part of your job description? How long have you been involved, and what was the path that led you to this weird little corner of the universe?
It was a bit of a long and sordid path. As I think in a prior interview with your colleagues, we actually had a discussion about where I started, and where I started was as a hacker at the age of 10, programming on a TRS-80 Model 1 Level 2, which is sitting about 12 feet to my left, and it's still operable, still in operating condition. I'm the hacker that went to law school. I'm not the lawyer that understands computers. So I've always had the technology, the computer foundation in everything that I've done. Out of law school, I became a prosecutor both in New York and down here in Florida, and I actually founded the Internet and Computer Crime Division of the State Attorney's Office here in Miami-Dade County. So security and cyber crime has always been near and dear to my heart. That was going back now, I hate to admit it, but about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago. So since then, I have been representing in the private sector technology companies that have security issues, that have service-related issues, that require a grassroots foundational understanding of the technology, the vendors, and how the different technologies merge and interact with each other. So that's how we do things here, and that's where I find myself today.
See, that I will say, amen. It is about time we got that kind of a substantive perspective into our conversation in the industry, right? We spend a lot of time saying things like regulatory compliance and cybersecurity vulnerabilities and liability, and I don't think most of the technology professionals in the world actually know what those terms mean, but I also think maybe we don't really fully appreciate the degree of seriousness of what we're doing, right? I can sell you a computer, and if that computer works, cool. If it doesn't work, well, I'm sorry, I'll try to fix it, but I'm really not legally on the hook for anything. I think that's a little different when it comes to the question of cybersecurity. Just at a high level, I'd love to get your opinion from a professional point of view about what are the stakes that a managed service provider is dealing with when they enter into cybersecurity services relationships with their customers.
Right. Well, I think that given today's given what's going on in the world today and how customers are interacting with MSPs, I think that MSPs fall into one of two categories. They either fall into the category of a service provider that has promised a certain level of security, okay, or they fall under the category of an MSP that hasn't promised it directly, but de facto, okay, will be required to offer at least a reasonable level of security. You're going to fit into one of those two categories. Maybe 10, 15 years ago or so, there might have been a third, maybe arguably, that a third category of the MSP that if the customer didn't ask for security, we don't offer security and they shouldn't expect it. Those days are gone. And I think that even if by contract an MSP is not required to provide a certain level or scope of service involving security, I think given today's circumstances, there is a built-in de facto standard level of reasonableness that every MSP has to abide by.
I appreciate that point of view. For many years, I've been trying to distinguish between the marketing messages we use in our industry, why you would buy from me, versus what the legal commitments and expectations are.
Right.
Everybody's marketing message says, come to us. It'll be the best experience you've ever had. Uptime and reliability, data access and privacy, and of course, everything will always be fine. 5 nines of uptime, right? We tend to make these vague statements about everything's going to be great without necessarily specifically labeling what the security commitments are.
Yeah.
I'm of the opinion, I'd like to know from your point of view, that blended side of the law and the operator's point of view. I go to the level where if I sell you a network, if I sell you connectivity to the outside world, and it does not come as a secure resource, that's tantamount to malpractice in the medical field. I haven't thought through the foreseeable consequences of connecting you to the world, and that by default comes with a responsibility. Am I going too far when I say malpractice?
Well, I don't know if you're going too far, but I do think it depends on the scenario that you're talking about. And we're going to begin with the foundational premise that MSPs should refrain from making the kind of grandiose promises and guarantees that you started off talking about. You can count on us 24/7. We are going to protect you from everything in the world. And with us, you're going to sleep well every night, 365 days a year. The problem with those grandiose type statements are they certainly are wonderful from a marketing perspective. They will pull in customers, but they'll become Exhibit A on the complaint filed in state or federal court when you're unable to provide that type of true top shelf level security on a 24/7 by 365 basis. So, these marketing claims, and we see these things all the time. MSPs coming in saying, listen, we have a couple of clients that are trying to get out of our 3 or 5 year deals because they're saying that we didn't live up to the marketing hype. Well, that's a problem, right? That is a problem. So the first thing that MSPs would be well advised to do is separate the marketing from the legal, right? And make it very clear that when it comes to contracting and when it comes time to sign on the dotted line, that the marketing was just that. It was marketing. It was not what's going to necessarily be what's in the service that you're providing. And that can only be done through the contract. So you want to make sure that your contract says, in either explicitly or in a very, very strong implicit way, that all these things that you talked about, marketing and advertising and so forth, they're not applicable right now. What you're going to get is what's in this agreement. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I think that we need to address is setting expectations. So you said, isn't it akin to malpractice? Really? So malpractice, using that by analogy, I think it's a good analogy. When you deal with malpractice, you look to a standard of care, right? Whatever that care is. And did the medical provider breach that standard and cause an injury? Right. So in the MSP world, I think that we can draw, in many cases, a similar analogy. Is there a standard of care? And did the MSP or the service provider breach that standard of care? And that really depends on, quite candidly, what your contract says. It's a creature of contract. If you want to have a very high degree of standard of care because you're dealing with the type of customer that demands it, right? A medical office, a construction firm, something that has some sort of mission critical applicability, well, then your contract can and should say that. And then, of course, you should be insured appropriately. But if you're not engaged in that world, if you're not engaged in the high risk mission critical world, then by all, it makes no sense to not limit it, to specifically say, listen, we're not offering that level. We're offering this level, whatever that level might be, because it's whatever you set up in the contract becomes the standard of care that you have to deliver. So sometimes it could be malpractice, sometimes not. Going into it blindly, though, is a bit of a minefield.
See, I think that is excellent tactical advice in the language and the structure of the contract, which, while all of us in the managed services world are familiar with the distinction between a transactional engagement where, basically my responsibility begins and ends with the facilitating of a delivery of a product or service, versus a contractual recurring revenue environment where my relationship continues through the duration.
Of course.
We're familiar with that from a commercial perspective. I don't think most of us have done enough thinking on the legal implications of that difference and what the higher commitments are that are getting made. I recognize a certain risk and reward in what you're describing. There's certainly a benefit to promising the very highest standard of care anybody can get from a marketing point of view. That's a competitive position where I might differentiate myself from anyone in the market. That's why you should choose me. That's why you should pay my higher rates, because we're committing to the highest standards. But with that reward comes tremendous risk on, that's a pretty high bar that you have to get over every time. I think maybe one of the challenges that we're seeing is that we're just not quite internally convinced of the value of the services we're providing at a basic level or an advanced level. If we were convinced that what we did was already valuable, we wouldn't feel the need to, take that to the nth degree to promise the sun and the stars in order to get people to sign up.
That's true. And I think that the flip side of the same coin is that MSPs need to not only understand the value that they bring to the table, but they also need to evaluate the liability that they're taking on compared to the value and plan accordingly. For example, if you have a project or a client that's going to give you $20,000 every year, well, you definitely don't want to take on $5 million worth of liability for a $20,000 client. There has to be some nexus, some relationship, some connection, reasonable connection between the value of the project and what you're taking on. So first you have to understand what your true value is, right? Not what you're bringing to them, but what you're receiving financially, cash-wise. And then you have to look at your agreements and say, what happens if something goes wrong? Right? What happens if something goes wrong? I think that, I've read contracts, and I guess I'll challenge your listeners out there right now. If they were to go to their contracts and they were to look at the limitation of liability section, that section that has the big capital letters that lawyers love to write, that talks about nobody is liable for indirect, special, exemplary, consequential, blah, 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 and all that stuff. I would challenge them to see whether their contract says that they've limited their liability, for example, to the amounts paid under the agreement, right? Paid under the agreement. So you would say, oh, well, that makes sense, right? I've limited my liability. So if I'm paid $20,000, then my liability is $20,000. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. For example, I said you're paid $20,000 a year. So if you mess something up after 6 months, you've been paid $10,000, your liability is $10,000. What if you have an agreement that continues until it's terminated by one client? And it's been your client, this person's been your client for 10 years. For 10 years at $20,000, suddenly your liability is $200,000. They've paid you $200,000 under the agreement. What if they've been your client for 20 years? You could see how the target keeps going up and up and up. And so, in the zeal to get it, to get these deals in the door, MSPs are not looking, not only, I agree with your point, they're not properly evaluating the value that they bring to the table. So they're overpromising and making these tremendous marketing promises that they shouldn't be making. But then in their agreements, they're not even limiting their liability. So there's no real connection between the amount of money they make and the liability that they're taking on. So these are two sides of the same coin, and MSPs would be well advised to consider this issue specifically when entering into any service agreement, not just security related, but certainly security related.
Yeah, well, and see, again, the lessons learned in other industries that have trod this path before, right? If the technology services industry is relatively recent and new into the business of contract services, right? Certainly it's been going on for decades in some areas, but became a phenomenon a decade or so ago, and everybody got into the business of contracts. Contracts have existed far before we got into them.
Right.
And we should probably learn lessons from other industries to limit liability and be specific on promises and commitments. I think we're all so thrilled with the idea of a commitment for continuous recurring revenue that we don't necessarily scrutinize the other side of the question of, yeah, but what commitments did I just make? Did I literally just promise the
Right.
sun and the stars and my firstborn in this contract relationship? I think that's a piece of what I'll refer to as maturing or professionalizing our industry.
Right.
You know, in the medical industry, you didn't used to have a license to practice, and now you do. In the legal field, there once were just advisors, and then they professionalized and got standards. Do you think that we will get to that point in technology services where we will professionalize to the point where certification and minimum standards training will be a requirement for entry?
You know, I've participated in and listened in on this exact debate, whether there should be some sort of certification requirement for MSPs and service providers. And, you know, it weighs on both sides. Well, you know, one side says there should be a certification because as we become more and more reliant on service providers, issues related to security and privacy and uptime and functionality and all these things become so crucial to our everyday lives. Our everyday lives, you know, not just email, but phones and Internet of Things, you know, making sure things are not only connected, but functioning and kept private and so forth. It's become so crucial that, you know, even dog sitting services have to be licensed, right? I mean, even, you know, some things that you'd say, really, that needs that needs a license because you're trusting your precious pet with these people. Well, you're trusting your precious information with these service providers. So the argument is it should be certified. It should have some regulation. The flip side is, well, how do you regulate that type of industry when there are so many solution providers? Some solution providers actually offer the service themselves, some resell a service, some white label other services and so forth. So under what circumstances do you require a certification? And if you're a mere reseller, why should you have to be certified at all? You're not even providing the service. Someone else is providing the service. You're just reselling it. You're just the conduit through which the end user reaches the ultimate solution provider. So it goes back and forth. Obviously, right now, there is virtually no regulation. I say virtually none because there are a couple of states like Louisiana, for example, that says that if you're an MSP and you're providing services to a state agency, then you must do certain things. You must disclose if there's a security breach and so on. Okay, fine. Other than that, and those are very few. I mean, you could count them on one hand. Other than that, there is no regulation. I think that at some point, what we're going to start to see is regulation, not just of MSPs per se, but regulation over issues, regulation over the issue of confidentiality, over security and privacy and so forth. I think that you're going to start to see regulation that impacts those overall areas, and MSPs are going to have to adapt to make sure they comply with them. I don't see regulation coming down on the MSP industry per se, because it's too complex, it's too diverse, too many variables and permutations. But I certainly almost expect that both state and federal regulation will start to be handed down in the area of cybersecurity and cyber privacy. And MSPs are going to have to adapt.
See, the implications ripple from that kind of a statement of, we know in the past that when regulations affect us and our clients, there's a new level of complexity and an entire industry of providers and tools springs up to address those kinds of complexities. I think you might be in a truly unique position to answer this question. Do our lawmakers, prosecutors, legal system framework, do those humans understand the issues that are at play here? And are they prepared to draft legislation that is modern to the internet and to connectivity and data and all that? Certainly, I think you would agree, some of the existing regulations are not exactly gracefully written for a modern technical world. Are they prepared to bring that kind of regulation in a relevant sense?
You know, you're talking to a very cynical person in that regard. So I'm going to give that disclaimer right up front. I think that from a legislative perspective, I have yet to meet a single legislator at the state level or at the federal level, and I know many at both levels. I've yet to meet one person who truly understands this kind of technology, understands the interaction of the technology, not just among providers to their end users, but from customers, among how customers interrelate with businesses, and then the businesses obviously interrelate with MSPs. I've never met a legislator that really understands this. So what they do is they form these subcommittees that come and testify. And who are these people? Well, these people are usually industry insiders that have vested interests in a particular strategy or a particular paradigm. So you might call in, and I'm not endorsing or trashing, I'm just throwing out, you might call someone in from Facebook or from Twitter or from Instagram or any of these social media groups. Well, Instagram and Facebook, same thing. But ultimately, you're going to call in these people who have financial vested interests in seeing the law go in one particular way over another. And while they might say, look, this is in the best interest of the public and so on. Well, is it really in the best interest of the public? Probably not. Probably not. It's not even probably. It definitely isn't. It's more in the interest of the company. But since the people asking the questions don't know what the answers should be, they don't know what the answer should be, then they accept these answers from the industry, and we get regulation that is either very, very pro-industry, anti-security, anti-privacy, or we get something that goes the entire opposite way that makes it almost untenable to move forward with innovation. I think that the legislators would be well advised when they're forming these sort of groups to look into these things, to call upon people like me and others like me that don't have a financial interest in seeing the industry go one way or the other, but they understand, people like me understand the issues and understand how they impact not only businesses, but the customers that use the technologies as well. Until that happens, and I don't see that happening anytime soon, we're going to have a patchwork of laws that probably won't work well with one another until something happens that requires uniformity. And that's when what I hope will happen, calling so-called neutral but educated people, that's when those tools will be utilized. I think we're pretty far from that right now, though, especially in this climate right now. I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat. I think anyone would agree we're pretty far away right now from having a bipartisan neutral look at technology in the marketplace. So I think that's a ways off.
Yeah, I would unfortunately completely agree with you. I'll think about it like this. When what we did as a technology industry amounted to the level of nice to have and peripheral kind of interesting things that, those of us in the IT department thought were fascinating, but the CFO was completely unimpressed and uninvolved. When we did that, whether or not we did it perfectly correctly was of minor consequence, right? Like maybe you would have an inconvenience associated with that. Our industry has, and this is a case of be careful what you wish for, right? We have been saying about ourselves for years, we're not just peripheral. We are mission critical. Your business cannot operate without the things that we do. God forbid they actually agree with you, because when they do, now it's no longer optional to do it well, and there would be consequences. I think the scary part of what you're talking about is that the only the only catalyst that will cause us to get to that point of regulation is something that's even more tragic than what we've already seen.
Something
right?
bad.
And,
Something's going to happen, right? And the amazing thing is that we've seen a lot of very bad things happen. I mean, we have become so jaded, for example, to breaches of security and breaches of privacy, that now it's ignored. I mean, it doesn't often even make the news. You hear about these corporations that have been hacked, and 10 million, 20 million, 50 million, 100 million identities have now been leaked into the dark web, or whatever it is. And the numbers are so astronomical that you can't picture it. Just as a person, you can't sort of picture what 100 million names and addresses and emails looks like. And coupled with that is the fact that it happens so often that it doesn't shock us anymore. It doesn't shock us. You sort of think, well, stinks for them. Anyway, what am I having for dinner? That kind of a thing. It's like a passing thought. I don't know when we became so jaded that we can now ignore the exponential increase in these types of incidents and the astronomical numbers that we're talking about. I don't know when we became so jaded. I don't know if there was a time. It probably evolved over the past 5, 6, 7 years or so. But I think that we're at the point now where if you turn around and pick your favorite retailer, look it up online. Pretty sure you're going to find, yep, they were hacked as well, and yeah, they let your stuff into the dark web and so on. I mean, I can't think of a vendor that's out there that isn't affected. Even restaurant chains are affected. Everything. So, and we just accept that. I don't think we should, but we do, and so there will come a day of reckoning. I'm not sure what will happen to cause that day or what the events of that day will be, but there will be a day of reckoning when people turn around and say, this is, we're no longer jaded.
See, and I go exactly where you're going. Those of us that have been doing cybersecurity for years, there's a special level of frustration of, this isn't the first time we've had this conversation. We've been standing at the door shouting about this for years, and all of the grown-ups have been saying, that's arcane. That's not something that I care about. I'm not really focused on this, until it arrived in mass to the point where it appeared to be overwhelming, and we went directly past the I'm yelling about this and nobody's taking me seriously to it is so serious that now people believe there's nothing you can do about it. It's not like you can actually solve this problem. So why stay up at night worrying about something that's unfixable?
I'll tell you, I think I agree with you. And I think that, if we're trying to figure out, if we're going to whip out our crystal ball and say, okay, look into the crystal ball and tell me what's going to happen, what will cause the day of reckoning to bring us to the point where we now know this is serious. I think my crystal ball, by the way, doesn't work any better than yours. But I think that it probably relies on, ready, drum roll, the insurance industry. I think that the day of reckoning is going to come when the insurance industry as a whole turns around in the area of security and says, no more. For example, MSPs constantly tell me that they cannot get their customers to implement 2FA. Something as simple as 2FA, right? Two-factor authentication. Why? Because the customers don't want to be bothered with it. They don't want to have to, hit the button on the phone. What if I don't have my phone? Then what? Then I can't use my application. All right. They don't want to be bothered with it. And part of the motivation of that is because they know that they have insurance, that if they're hacked, so we'll file an insurance claim. The insurance company will pay the hacker. They'll pay the 10 Bitcoin or whatever it is, and we'll move forward. And to date, a lot of insurance companies have been doing exactly that. They have been insuring without proper underwriting, not realizing the risks. But I think that is changing. It is changing. And now you see that insurance companies are not only making it more expensive to insure for those types of risks. Some insurance companies are getting out of that business altogether and saying, look, under OFAC and so forth, we can't even pay these Bitcoins anymore because we don't know. We might be sending them to companies that are on the OFAC list, people that are on the OFAC list, and we can't help you. And now it comes back down the chain to the merchant. And all they had to do was implement 2FA, and they didn't. Now what? See, I think that, it's interesting. I grew up in New York, and on snow days, right, when it snowed, now I'm in Florida, it doesn't snow down here, but on snow days, you'd wake up in the morning and you'd always think, is the school going to close? Are they going to close the school because it's a snow day? What I find out later on growing up is the school didn't make that decision. The school was not the one that closed itself on a snow day. You know who made the decision? The bus company. The bus company would make a decision whether they were going to let the buses drive. And if the buses weren't driving, there were no kids, the school would close. See, I think that the same thing is happening now. It's not the merchants, it's not the service providers, it's going to be the insurance company. The insurance company is going to say, we're not letting our drivers drive today. We're not letting them drive anymore. Now you're going to have to do something until that day comes. And I think that day is coming. It's a little bit off still, but I think that's where you're going to see it. That's my great prediction for 2021.
See, I think you're onto something there. What was it last week? I think I read an article about, and don't quote me on this if it's not specifically accurate to the entity, but I believe it was AXA, the insurance company that has made a formal statement now that they will no longer insure for the payment of ransoms. They will insure for business interruption and for loss of intellectual capital, et cetera, but not for the payment of ransoms.
Right.
That seems like
so you know what's going to happen.
Very logical first step.
Of course. So what's going to happen is companies are going to get hit. They're going to see they don't have coverage. And the first thing they're going to say is there ought to be a law. And here we go. And here we go. Game on.
And off to the races.
Somebody screams that, we're going to stay with the patchwork that we have right now, which is sort of a fiefdom of little islands, unaffiliated islands that don't really protect the industry and don't regulate the industry. And so there's a lot of customer beware out there.
And I mean, again, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, everything in technology was buyer beware. These days, right. I think we might be, and in the most silver lining interpretation of this issue, as victims of our own success, customers have actually agreed with the value proposition. My business will operate more effectively, more profitably with technology than it could without technology. So I've designed it in to every essential function, right? The unfortunate buzzword in the industry is digital transformation, and we can all argue about what we mean by that, but essentially what it means is everything is now connected to the internet, from your supply chain to your demand chain, from your operations, your finance, your intellectual property. Everything is now connected to the internet, and ... It's no longer optional that you deliver to that level of expectation. But you touched on it earlier. Sometimes the solutions, and I want to dispel the myth that this is a problem that cannot be solved. Sometimes what makes my face hurt is that the solution is blindingly obvious and not that expensive, right? If we would manage patch updates, if we would deploy 2FA, if we would do what, as industry practitioners, what we think are kind of obvious and easy things, most of those consequences can be avoided, at least for your patch of customers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. These are not necessarily hard fixes. They are fixes that demand change. And it's the change that is preventing them from moving forward. The change of 2FA, the change of, having to verify through a text or a phone call before you're able to access an application. Not a hard thing to do. Certainly, if they offered you a coupon for a free burger somewhere, you'd do it in a heartbeat, right? If you're trying to protect yourself against some amorphous, vague, and ambiguous threat that's lurking out there, you immediately think, one, why would they be picking on me? So I'm probably not a target. And then two, how much extra time is it going to take in my work day? And on balance, a lot of people say it's not worth it. that's a choice they're making because they don't understand, they don't feel the pain yet, but they will. They will.
Yeah, I see. I think that is the good news as well as potentially bad news is that this has, I believe, risen to a level where we have to begin to pay attention to it. And the best evidence I have of that is the number of people who do not have anything to do with the technology industry. They work in restaurants, they work in media and entertainment, they have nothing at all to do with technology. And cybersecurity is dinner time conversation amongst the people, right? We've been talking about it for years. It's finally risen to the level where non-practitioners think this stuff matters, and maybe that will spur us to a higher level of execution. In the couple of minutes that we have left, I'd love to get some practical recommendations from you. If we're talking to the industry, to the practitioners of cybersecurity, what do they need to be doing to make sure that they are okay and that their customers are okay with the respect to these legal commitments and the liabilities associated with cybersecurity?
Sure. Well, I think that I'll start with the last part first. What do MSPs, what should service providers do to make sure their customers are okay? I think the first thing they need to do is audit their customers. Every project, every relationship should begin with some sort of audit to get an idea, to get your hands around what the customer has, what the customer doesn't have. There needs to be some sort of gap analysis where the MSP can look and say, listen, this is what you need. Now, why is that important? It's important because customers and users we're talking about, they don't know what they don't know, right? They have no idea of all the threats that are out there. They read about them in the newspaper. Like I said, 100 million IDs were stolen. Okay, 100 million. It means nothing at this point. It's etherware. It's in the vapor, right? It's in the air. But they don't know what they don't know. So there has to be an education that the MSP gives to the customer that can be done through some sort of audit, gap analysis, and explaining the threats. Not just you're under threat. You could be a target. Yeah, I know. We could all be a target. I could be hit jaywalking in Manhattan, though everybody jaywalks in Manhattan anyway. They need to understand the true nature of what we're talking about. And then if the customer isn't quite getting it, it behooves the MSP to send them something else, whether it's a declination letter, right? You've declined this service. You've told us that you don't want this. And just so you know, customer, by declining it, these are the vulnerabilities that you're facing. Again, not only are you educating your customer about what the real threat is, but you're actually getting a second bite at the apple of selling that service to them, right? You're getting a second bite of reminding them of how bad things are. So if they didn't get it the first time, they might get it the second time. I think that that's what MSPs need to be doing with all of their customers at the outset of the relationship and on a continuing basis. Every year, 6 months, every year, write to your clients. If you haven't reached out to them and spoken to them in any other way, this is what's going on. That's what's going on. Does this keep you up at night? Will it keep you up at night now? If so, talk to us. I think this type of education is very important. I think that what MSPs need to do from their own perspective to protect themselves from customers that simply don't understand, right? Or just are litigious. Unfortunately, there are a few out there. I think that, and this is my mantra, that MSPs must have clear agreements that not only address legal, but they address the realities of the industry. Very unique industry that we have. Very unique. I mean, how many industries do you have that you're going to tell customers to do things, they won't listen to you. Customers are going to be plugging things in and out of a network, expecting you to fix it. Customers will not truly understand the security issues that they face, yet they're counting on you to give them security and maybe even regulatory compliance. I mean, think of all the things. What else can you throw into that pot? And then I'd say, and that's this industry. That's not no other service industry. Attorneys don't have to worry about that. Medical industry doesn't have to worry about that. Service industry, IT providers do. So they need clear agreements. They need statements of work that lay out not only what they're going to do, but what they're not going to do. what they're not going to do. So if there ever comes a time when a customer looks and says, why don't I have this? Why didn't I do this? Why didn't you implement 2FA? Right? Why didn't you do that? Why didn't you do, whatever it is that would have prevented this horrible thing from happening? You can point to something, not a conversation, not a phone call, point to something, a contract, a statement of work, something that says, because we offered it and you didn't want it. And then we offered it again and explained it. And again, you didn't want it. Talk to the insurance company. And of course, at that point, you hope the insurance company hasn't taken the position of, we're not covering it, because then you're going to hear there ought to be a law. So we've come full circle.
Absolutely. See, and in the spirit of our previous conversation about the professionalizing of the industry, if in the legal industry, if you were going to perform that kind of an audit service, that would be a chargeable event. That is not a marketing pitch. That is not a free assessment for the sake of, test driving my car. That is professional service with meaningful consequence. It is a chargeable event.
It's a very valuable service.
That to your agreement.
Sure. It's a very valuable service. It's the equivalent of an MRI or an X-ray that a physician will take, right? To figure out what's going on internally in your company and where your deficiencies are and where you have exposure, where you have a break. So I think that they should be treated as such.
Excellent point. Obviously, this is a deep topic that we could go on and on about. I love to get that real legal perspective from you on things that we've been wrestling with as technologists for years, but not necessarily at that proper level. So if folks would like to get more information from you, follow you out there in the world, how can they follow you in the podcast and social media world? What's your contact information in case people have some follow-up questions to this conversation?
They can write to us. They can write to me, Brad, at bradleygross.com. They can call 954-217-6225. Or, and I would recommend that everyone do it, they can follow the Technology Bradcast, which is actually called technologybradcast.com. It is a broadcast. It is a podcast that is devoted to these exact issues: security and privacy and MSP contracts and so forth. So I would think that every MSP should be listening into that.
Heartily agree with that and endorse the conversation, because it is a season of developing and advancing the value we deliver and the expectations that our customers have. And as we said earlier, God forbid they actually agree with what you're promising and then hold you accountable in the end. Let's make sure we're ready here. So, Brad, thank you very much for your time today and joining the podcast. Excellent pieces of tactical information. So we really appreciate getting your point of view. For those of you that are listening, anyone in the IOTA community, please do reach out and let us know your feedback to this conversation, any questions you may have, or other topics that we can dig into, and we will continue to refine and focus in the Secure Connections podcast to make sure it is as meaningful to you as possible. For now, thank you very much. We appreciate your time. We'll talk to you again on the next episode of Secure Connections.